multiple claims as to who was the first Minnesotan volunteer of the Civil War. Could it have been an Anokan? After that, we'll learn all about the men and women of Anoka's own Company A of the 8th. After that, Vickie Wendel tells us all about the Sanitary Commission and the home front. Then, we'll be remembering the Army of the Grand Old Republic. All that and more as we study the Civil War in this episode of It's Your History. A point of pride among local Civil War historians is that Minnesota can claim they had some of the very first to volunteer to join and fight with the Union Army. But who was the very first? Some people claim it was a young man hailing from St. Paul, while some others closer to home claim that it could have been an Anokan. So who was the very first to volunteer to take up the cause?
On April 12, 1861, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, the U.S. military installation, and it was considered to be the very beginning of the U.S. Civil War. Of course, the Confederacy had officially organized months before, but this was the first military attack, and it was the beginning of the Civil War.
Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was blockaded by the South. President Lincoln, in April, decided that he was going to break that siege by sending in a resupply ship to Fort Sumter. It was turned back. On the 12th of April, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. It surrendered 33 hours later, and at that point the nation was at war. Now back in Washington, President Lincoln called a cabinet meeting to be held. This was an emergency cabinet meeting to be held on Sunday morning. Our own Minnesota Governor, Alexander Ramsey, happened to be in Washington at the same time.
When Ramsey got the news of the attack from Secretary of War Simon Cameron, he immediately offered 1,000 troops from Minnesota to help put down the Confederacy. Now, this is going to be one full day before President Lincoln makes his official announcement and his call for 75,000 troops to be raised to put down the Confederacy. And so Ramsey's offer is the first troops to be offered for the Union cause.
Now, how did word get back to Minnesota?
So immediately he sends back message via telegraph from Washington back to Minnesota, and he sends this message to two people. He sends it to William H. Acker, who was the Adjutant General of Minnesota at the time, and he sent it to Willis A. Gorman, who was a political ally of Ramsey's. He was a former territorial governor, and so he gets this message back to St. Paul and back to Minnesota. Now, Gorman, though, is not in St. Paul at the time. We find out that he's in Anoka at the time. He's trying a case. The court records show that he was the defense counsel for a man accused of stealing 10 bushels of cranberries, some flour, a flour sack, and a bed ticking. So pretty major case that he's involved in.
Well, the telegraph arrived at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, the 15th of April. Lieutenant Governor Ignatius Donnelly got that telegram, spread the word, and immediately called a meeting with the captain of the St. Paul Pioneer Guard, the premier guard unit in Minnesota. They scheduled a meeting for that evening and notified all the members of the Minnesota Pioneer Guard. They all gathered at the Armory in downtown St. Paul in a large room. And the purpose of that meeting was to offer the Pioneer Guard to defense of the Union as a company. But now many of the members of the Guard were pretty well-connected and influential businessmen. They really couldn't drop everything and run off to war, and they pretty much informed the captain of that. So the captain said, well, it looks like we can't take the whole company right now, but here's what we're going to do. They took a small notebook and they said, we're going to have each of you who can and want to go right now to sign your name on the notebook, and then we're going to open it up to anybody else the next morning, and come on up and sign the note.
There's not a wire between Anoka and St. Paul, so the message gets to him on horseback. And so when the message arrives, Gorman calls for a recess, and he makes his announcement about the attack, and he says that they're looking for volunteers to help put down the rebellion. Now, Aaron Greenwald is one among probably, we think, 6 or 7 Anoka residents and people near the community that were there and offered their hands. And Greenwald is acknowledged to be the first guy to raise his hand for that group. But he doesn't get down to Fort Snelling for a couple of days later. At that point, some other folks have certainly been volunteering. Art Acker gets his word out, and there are people that volunteer in St. Paul that evening, including a guy by the name of Josiah King. But who was Greenwald? Who was this guy that here in Anoka we consider to be the first of the first? He's 28 years old when he raises his hand to volunteer for the Union. And he's mustered, when he gets down to Fort Snelling, he is mustered into Company C of the 1st Minnesota. And so he's mustered in as a corporal, probably an acknowledgement as being one of the first volunteers. So he's shot on the battlefield on July 3rd, and then they pick him up on July 4th, still alive but suffering, and then he dies in a field hospital the next day. So Greenwald does not return home from the war, so he is not really around to make his claim that he's the first of the first. And in many ways, people didn't seem to care too much about it. There wasn't a lot of talk about who was the first of the first for many of the years immediately following the war. But the debate did start to rage on a little bit, and the Grand Army of the Republic, a group of Union soldiers who did things after the war, put up a memorial in the city of St. Paul honoring the men of the 1st Minnesota. It's a tall obelisk. Some of you might have seen it. It stands between the state capitol and the St. Paul Cathedral. It's a tall obelisk, and up on the top of it is a statue of a man. It's Josiah King, and there's a marker there that says that Josiah King is the first volunteer of the 1st Minnesota, essentially making him the first of the first.
Josiah Ringate King happened to be sitting right next to the captain. He immediately stepped up, stepped over to the table, signed his name, looked up and said, "Here's one for the war." And so he became the first name on that list of members of the Pioneer Guard. The next morning, on the 16th of April, Tuesday morning, a flag was hung outside the armory, and the army was turned into a recruiting station, and by that evening they had 125 men. But now concurrently, that same day, Lieutenant Governor Donnelly issued a proclamation that said, "We are accepting recruits, and precedent among those recruits will go to the existing militia organizations of the state should they meet all the required provisions for enlisting as 3-month volunteers in the Union Army." Company A of what would become the 1st Minnesota was the Minnesota St. Paul Pioneer Guard. And so thus Josiah King, by being the first volunteer of that first company to be offered and accepted by the state of Minnesota for their new regiment, which then was offered to and accepted by the federal government, King by all rights is the first volunteer in the Union Army.
But that's only the beginning of the debate. Alva Eastman, who was the editor of a St. Cloud newspaper, the St. Cloud Journal, was adamant that Greenwald was the first, and he had said in several newspaper articles that he had evidence to say that Greenwald was the first. Now, to our knowledge, this evidence never surfaced that Eastman had, but what we do know is that Gorman was in the courtroom that morning, and that he called for the volunteers, and that there were witnesses that said Greenwald was among those that volunteered. So, who was the first of the first? Well, here in Anoka County, there's little debate about that.
So who was the very first? Well, I guess that depends on whether you consider to be the first person to raise his hand or the first person to sign his name on the dotted line. Coming up next, we'll take a look at a company in the Union Army that can be said to be Anoka's very own when we return to It's Your History.
Offering live event coverage via our website and on-demand streaming of regular programs.
Many American towns saw some of their own off to join the Union Army, and many brave soldiers represented their hometowns with honor in some particularly bloody battles in both the Dakota War and the Civil War. Minnesotans couldn't have been more proud than to have been represented by a good deal of their own men and women in Company A of the 8th.
The 8th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry was formed in the summer of 1862. It was common for the men in one area to be assigned at the same unit, and Company A was made up almost entirely of Anoka County men. The 8th was recruited by an Anoka man, John S. Cady, with the intentions of fighting the Confederacy, but before the 8th was fully mustered in, they were called in to fight another war. In August of 1862, less than 2 weeks after the 8th Minnesota was organized, and what was called then the Sioux Uprising and is now known as the Dakota War, began in west central Minnesota. Companies of the 8th were immediately sent to patrol the western counties of Minnesota to protect and defend the settlers. Company A was assigned to patrol the areas around the towns of Anoka and Princeton. The 8th wintered at the Chippewa Agency along the Crow River, and the summer of 1863 saw them back on patrol, mostly on horses rather than marching, and back into conflict with the Dakota. Company A's captain, Captain Cady, was killed in June, and Marcus Butterfield, also of Anoka, became its captain. They spent the next winter at Fort Abercrombie in Dakota Territory and began a campaign against the Dakota in the spring of 1864, before they were sent south to join the fight against the Confederacy in October. The 8th was assigned to the 23rd Army Corps and did service in Tennessee, Washington, D.C., and North Carolina. They returned to Fort Snelling and were mustered out on July 11, 1865. The regiment lost one officer, Captain Cady, and 26 enlisted men to fighting and another 56 to disease during their service. John Cady was well known in Anoka County before the summer of 1862. He was 26 years old and working as a surveyor, having arrived in Minnesota sometime between 1858 and 59. When a call came from the federal government for additional troops for the Union Army, John raised a company of infantry. His successful recruiting efforts were resulted in Company A of the 8th Minnesota and Volunteer Infantry being composed almost entirely of Anoka County men, with Cady as its captain. Knowing these willing volunteers were inexperienced, John secured a drill master for them, and the men of Company A were soon responding to marching and firing commands quite well. Even before John and his company were formally mustered in, conflict with the Dakota Indians in western Minnesota demanded their services. People across Minnesota and Anoka County were terrified of attacks from the Dakota. Many of them came to Anoka from their farms as they believed Anoka was a big enough town for them to be safe from attack. Captain Cady and Company A were stationed near Manana in Meeker County by June 11, 1863, when word reached that a group of Indians were accused of stealing some horses. Cady led a patrol to look for them, and the patrol was near Candiyohi Lakes when they found the Dakota Braves. Two men from Anoka, Edward Clinch and Elias Pratt, were with the captain when an Indian slid down on the far side of his horse and galloped by and fired from underneath the animal's neck. The shot hit John in the head, and he was killed instantly. The men brought the body back of their fallen captain to Anoka, and when other friends secured a metallic coffin so John's body could be returned to his family in New York. The St. Paul newspapers called Cady one of the best officers in the regiment, and that he was universally respected by his comrades. Lydia Hancock was one of the few women who set off to war. She worked as a nurse for Company A of the 8th Minnesota Infantry, which her husband Charles served in. The couple farmed outside of Elk River, but were well known in the communities of Anoka and Ramsey, and lay a stone's throw across the county line. Lydia assisted the men of Company A from the time it was organized in the summer of 1862 until she was honorably released in February of 1864. Charles enlisted in Anoka the day the news broke of the first skirmish of the Dakota War. The captain of Company A, John S. Cady, gathered recruits from Anoka County and the surrounding areas. The regiment was assigned immediately, even before many of the men were formally mustered into the service, to defend the settlers in western Minnesota and against the Dakota. Lydia was superintendent of a Sabbath school when Charles enlisted, but that was not enough to keep her on the farm. Why did she give up the comforts of her home to follow the Army? Records note that it was by the request of Captain John Cady. Cady was probably well known in the small community. That was one of the reasons why he was such a successful recruiter. Perhaps he asked Lydia to be a nurse because he was aware of some special skills she had, or maybe he knew her and Charles. Applying to become a nurse was not as easy as it may seem, even if the captain requested her. Lydia had to petition General Pope, then at Fort Snelling in St. Paul. Pope was careful to only give Lydia verbal permission to accompany the regiment. No paper trail would indict him should his actions be questioned. The Union Army had little time for women, so nurses had to work as volunteers, especially early in the war. Many believed that women were not strong enough to withstand the horrors of an Army hospital. Thus, most nurses were men when the war began. Women like Lydia would soon prove the Union Army wrong. Lydia was invaluable to the company. She arrived at the Chippewa Agency along the Crow Wing River and immediately set to work to administer the hospital of the men suffering from measles. The disease spread rapidly. Lydia nursed the men through the outbreak, sending a message to Captain Katie: "All is well, not a man lost." In April 1863, Lydia followed the company to Fort Ripley near the Little Falls, and from there to Fort Abercrombie in the Dakota Territory the next winter. By spring, her health was nearly broken and she needed a rest. She returned to Anoka and remained there as the regiment went south to fight the Confederates. She waited for Charles to return. When the war was over, Charles did come back, but very ill. Lydia drew on every nursing skill she had to help him survive. She kept him alive until 1886, though he was declared invalid. And even though Charles passed away, Lydia joined the local chapter of the Women's Relief Corps. The WRC cared for veterans, widows, and orphans. Lydia gave many years of her life and substantial amounts of her money to the organization. She was elected president of the Minneapolis chapter and the State Department head. While involved with the WRC, Lydia lobbied for pensions for Army nurses. The issue was debated at local and national levels through the 1880s, and by 1892, all former Army nurses could apply for their own pensions. And when Lydia died in 1914, the Minneapolis newspaper carried a long obituary noting her accomplishments, included this last bit of prose that read, "Not dead, but only promoted. She has entered the order above, and there, 'neath the smiles of the master, she will finish her labor of love."
Minnesotans can be truly proud of their contributions to the war efforts of the time through brave soldiers willing to risk everything for their loved ones back home. And a good number of them Anokans. While not all of the people marching with the Army were soldiers, and not all of them were men. We'll find out more about that when we return with It's Your History.
I'm on Sunfish Lake in Ramsey, and you're watching QCTV.
With the war in full swing, soldiers always seem to be on the move. Supplies, however, were not. With the luxury of today's modern transportation, it can be easy to forget just how difficult a simple supply transfer can be when you're limited to the resources of horse-drawn carriage and hospital ships. Enter the Soldiers' Aid Society, sometimes known as the Ladies' Aid Society.
When the Civil War broke out in 1861, there were just over 2,000 people living in Anoka County at the time, including Minnesotan County, which was not part of Anoka County, but is today. And there was about 2,100 people. About 600 of them were men of military service age, between 18 and 45. So you take out the women, the children younger than the age of 18, and the men older than 45, and about half of those men that were eligible served in the Civil War. So that's a lot of people serving in the war at the time. A lot of them have their mothers, their wives, their sisters and brothers and family here. A lot of people here on the home front in Anoka County were left behind, but were very interested in what was going on in the war and very interested in supporting and helping the service members in the war. And so it was, at the beginning, there was not a lot of a national network that was able to establish and help out on those things. And some of those things started to happen on a more sort of grassroots level. And so things were being sent to the front that they didn't need. And so there was obviously a need for some greater coordination with that. And so to find out exactly how that happened and how Anoka County was fighting the war on the home front, I've asked Vickie Wendel, the program manager at the Anoka County Historical Society, to join us today. And so Vickie's going to be talking to us about the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the Soldiers' Aid Society. Let's start with a very basic question. What is the Soldiers' Aid Society?
Soldiers' Aid Society is exactly what it sounds like. It was a group of people, not necessarily all women, but the majority by far were women, that would get together and do something that they could do to help support the soldiers, be it knitting socks and mailing them off, or mailing off packages of fruits and vegetables, anything that they could do to help the soldiers. And that's what the Soldiers' Aid Society was. Some of them called themselves Ladies' Aid Society and restricted membership to just women. Others were more open and anybody could be part of it.
So 32,000 chapters. Were there any in Anoka County?
We know of 2. We suspect there were more because almost every church had one. We know there was one, a very active one, just across the river here into Champlin. And then there was another one that was located with the Methodist Church ladies in Anoka. We're fairly sure there were more. Records are very scanty. We lost so many of our early records and fires and such that we don't have documentation, but there's pretty good evidence we think there were more.
Well, I know at some of the programming that we've done at the historic site that you've spearheaded our Sanitary Commission Fair, sort of essentially a reenactment of it. Tell me a little bit more about what a Civil War era Sanitary Commission Fair might have looked like, where it might have taken place, and the layout of it.
They had some big ones. The biggest one in our area would have been in Chicago. One of the things that they did at the Philadelphia Fair was to create since they were in Philadelphia, they had the U.S. Mint. They created a special coin, and they brought the minting machine right out to the fair, and you could go, and for a price, you could have this copper coin minted.
Commemorative coin and purchase it. Yeah, I mean, that's the type of thing that we do today for fundraisers.
Absolutely. Many things were done as fundraisers. They would raffle a lot of things. All kinds of things would happen at these fairs to earn money. They even had huge parades, and people could pay money for the parades. A post office was often included in these fairs, and it was kind of a weird post office because the mail never went anywhere. But if I wanted to use a post office, I could go leave my letter at the fair post office for you, and then I would have to go and pick it up. But you still had to put a stamp on that letter, and the stamp, of course, would cost you 10 cents or whatever it was. And it didn't go anywhere. The main attraction there was for the gentlemen to leave letters because the postmistresses were always the prettiest young ladies in the community.
Well, we were talking about some of it's advancing the cause of women, and I suppose in some cases setting them back as well.
Yes, to some degree, yes. But it was a good ploy, and it was such a ploy that it was even advertised as such, that the prettiest ladies in the community would be handling the postal department. Once the war was over, it was thought by many groups that they would support the war effort because after the war, women would get the right to vote. When that didn't happen, many women channeled all that energy and all that experience of fundraising, political pressure, networking. They took all that and they started channeling it towards the women's movement, and the women's movement took off. Still took quite a few years before women got the vote, but that was their next goal. And a lot of these women really worked from one level at the Soldiers' Aid Societies and the Sanitary Commission right into suffrage for women.
As we can see, the war had great impact not just on those fighting it, but for those at home. And it wasn't just, it wasn't over once Confederates surrendered at Appomattox. These things had ripple effects and waves throughout society for years and years to come, and we're still feeling them today. So, Vickie, thank you for joining us, and thank you for telling us about the Sanitary Commission and the Soldiers' Aid Society.
You're welcome. There's lots more to learn.
I'm sure there is.
Amazing to think that even today, modern humanitarian organizations have these 19th century causes to thank for providing the blueprint. After the break, we'll find out what some Vietnam War vets have done in honor of their fallen forebears when It's Your History returns.
Allison is my friend. We met in school when we were younger and grew up together. We did everything together. Then one day something happened, and people started to tease her, being really mean. At first she would pretend it was no big deal, that it didn't hurt her. But after a while it started to get to her. Her grades started to slip, and she used to be such an awesome student. Then she stopped talking to everyone, even me. Now she's not around anymore, and I miss her so much. Allison was my friend.
It's been almost a century and a half since the Civil War, but the deeds of those soldiers and their war efforts have not been forgotten. Recently, the Vietnam Veterans of America have undertaken an effort to make sure that no veteran of the Civil War will go without a grave marker.
We've been talking quite a bit about the American Civil War, and after the Civil War, after many of the soldiers came home, they started something called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And I think for today's viewers, it might be easy to think about it as sort of a what today's VFW or American Legion would be like. It was a group, it was the soldiers getting together afterwards to get together to talk about veterans issues and beyond that as well. And so this group of GAR people went on to become pillars in the community, and they were the movers and shakers of the community afterwards. And they often use their veteran experience as a way to frame their own identities, and it was the way that the community viewed the returning soldiers as well. And so I kind of want to talk about that a little bit with my guest today. I'm here with Dick Bergling and Mike Clark, and Dick and Mike are members not of the GAR, but of a similar kind of group. They're not that old. They are members of the Anoka County chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America. First of all, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome.
I know we mentioned a little bit about the GAR is responsible for a lot of things after the war. Many Union veterans saw their shared experiences and commonalities as a reason why they came together. Do you think veterans of the Vietnam War share a similar shared identity?
Yeah, I think so. When we came home, we were chastised by our country. We were, I would say, I guess I would call it marginalized. And for a time, we kind of stumbled around in the dark. We knew that there were other veterans out there and had same types of experiences that each of us had. And somehow it seemed like it would, eventually we came together and formed our own organization because the issues that we were dealing with were not being dealt with.
So could you tell me a little bit about how it came up that you guys decided to take on some of these grave marker projects and why you did it?
Well, we started at, we Oakwood, is that right by Main Motors?
Mm-hmm.
And actually there's a guy that he had the idea, but he was, he wasn't active in the chapter, but he just came up with, you know, the stone. There are stones that need replacing at Oakwood, and so we went from there. And we would go and to the cemetery, and we would put shaving cream on the, and you know, and then pour water on it and try to get a reading of what the name might be. And we'd go to the city records, and if we found something, we'd go to the veteran service officer and order stones.
What we tried to do is come together as a chapter, mm-hmm. as a chapter. So we tried to do things that appealed to everybody in our membership, that everybody could participate. And the headstones was another one of those issues that brought us closer together.
Yeah.
And I think at the time that we did it, we didn't really look at what the connection was. All we knew were these were veterans, and they, like us, were fading away.
Well, guys, I think what we always try to do at the County Historical Society is not just tell stories about what had happened, but really sort of try to bring it into the effect that it has on the present day and how people are feeling about it. And so I think, you know, talking to you guys has been extremely helpful in that. And so thanks for joining me. Thank you. Obviously, thank you for your service, but thank you for your continued service in this. To sort of hear you talk about the memorials that you guys are working on that aren't just for Vietnam veterans, but for the rest. I mean, to know that you guys have that sort of global perspective on it is really great.
The Grand Army of the Republic certainly took steps to assure that we would always be able to treasure the memories of our fallen kinsmen in the Civil War. Thanks to efforts of such organizations as the Vietnam Veterans of America, it will assuredly be so. More coming up on It's Your History.
I just ran the mustache run, and you're watching QCTV.
From the first Minnesotan volunteers to the men and women who marched and fought to the people who gave their time and energy keeping them well, that has been our journey through the Civil War. That's all for this episode. Thanks again for joining us for It's Your History.